Hello, everyone. Today, I'm back with Claire Ray Randall, um, who we talked with, there must be about a month, 6 weeks ago now, on the whole issue of transgender toilets, mainly looking at transgender toilets in the UK and a bill that Maria Miller is trying to get through Parliament so that we could have to have them here. And I think they are already actually being put in here in schools, in universities and places like that. So that was the initial conversation. And then we had a quite general conversation around Claire's experience, because she had herself medical sex reassignment about 30 years ago. So she speaks as a transsexual, but at the same time, she has a degree in psychology, and she also studied biological psychology. And she was also around Leeds University when they set up their gender department. And she's got quite some interesting information to tell us about what she saw at those times and how that sort of embryonic gender studies has grown into this nightmare that we have now, with where people have their own invented pronouns and so on. So I think that's more or less it. That's what we're going to be talking about. So let's get on with it. Hi, Claire. Are you there?
Hi, Annie. I'm here, yeah.
Great. So the first thing I want to ask you is what's happening with Maria Miller? Is she still trying to get that bill through Parliament where we're going to have to all have transgender toilets?
Well, there's absolutely no progress in Parliament officially. I've looked at the Hansard and Parliament websites, and it's been put back again, basically. I think it was being put back to April. It was due to be debated back in February. It was put back to April. Now it's been put back to May. There's no detail, no documents on it, no text, nothing. So it's kind of good news and bad news, really. I think, it's kind of good news that it's not making any headway, but at the same time it's kind of bad news that they're not really letting anybody know what they're trying to foist on us. So I think we have to keep an eye on this, and I think they might be realising that there's a little bit more resistance to this idea than they actually originally imagined, because this is obviously it's very heavily driven by the political left. They desire to destroy our concepts of gender, which is why I call my book The War on Gender. And we see one of the aspects of this we're seeing becoming quite prevalent at the moment is this idea that we should all be using these what Dr. Jordan Peterson calls made-up pronouns. These some places they have, I think Facebook, last time I counted, had 38 different genders. And apparently New York State has a larger number than that. And so this is what these people are trying to do. Is they're not only trying to create a world in which anybody can be either male or female according to their whim of the moment, but even actually the next step, which they're already trying to implement in a lot of places, is, well, universities of course, is this idea that to use gendered pronouns he and she is oppressive. This is the line that they always take. If they don't like something, if they want to show something, it's oppressive. Women having children is oppressive. And we have a big episode of resistance to this. I'm very, very pleased to say I recently discovered Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who is a clinical psychologist, and I think he's at Toronto University, and he has challenged these made-up pronouns big time, because the students' union tried to get the university to implement an order that people must use certain words. And one of his arguments is that it's all very well being prohibited from using certain words, but to say that you must use certain words, of course, is entirely the other way around. You can say, oh, well, you can't use certain words because they're, deeply offensive to black people or something like that, and that's fair enough. But when you say, oh, you must use this word to describe people who refuse to accept the gender classifications of mainstream society, then of course you're into a whole kind of quagmire, nightmare of what on earth do people mean. And I mean, coming from my own biological psychology background, of course we have, all advanced species have male and female. We have many languages which are gendered, such as French, and the gendered nature of reality, I think we mentioned this last time, the gendered nature of reality is recognised throughout virtually every single belief system, religion, language, culture and everything. So it's all very well for somebody to come along with some new scientific theory and prove it and say, oh, well, look, you know, the Earth goes round the sun and so now we have to revise our way of talking about these things. But actually, what they're doing is they're creating a paradigm, a reality in which there is actually no evidence upon which they're doing it. It's not like suddenly somebody discovered some new scientific principle which throws everything we always knew out of the window. Rather, it's the case that they're trying to impose from above what they consider the ethical or fair or just interpretation of reality onto the reality, the objective reality, the evolutionary reality that we've all seen and grown up in, and everything that has been the way the world is forever. And what they're trying to do now is they're not trying to nibble away at the edges and make minor nuances. They're trying to change the entire way of thinking, which is, and this has really pretty much only happened since the inauguration of President Obama. And it's kind of quite interesting that this is also the same kind of era in which I spent a fair bit of time in the company of a number of doctoral students and some staff members from the Leeds Gender Studies department, which I came across in the mid-noughties, I suppose it was. And, well, I did seriously consider about it, and I was going through the process of approaching and applying to take a master's and then possibly a doctor's at gender studies, but then I realised that it's completely against the evolutionary psychology that I learnt so much about in the past. So what we have here is really an attempt to completely reverse the basis of our knowledge and understanding of human beings, biology. I mean, there was even one, I think he was a gender studies lecturer, who on a TV discussion panel, he claimed that the idea of biological sexes had actually been disproved and discounted. And Dr. Peterson has been calling for an opportunity to debate this chap on the subject because, well, I think we need a bit of evidence for a suggestion like that. So that is kind of encapsulated the whole, kind of thing that we're up against at the moment. But I'm sure that's raised all sorts of thoughts, Annie. So what do you think?
Well, I think it's quite fascinating, and I just find that I've said this before to you, but I'm going to say it again. I think you're uniquely qualified to talk about this, because not only having been through the sex reassignment when you did, at a very different time to now, 30 years ago, when it took enormous courage to go through that. Now you'd just be one of the crowd, but then it took enormous courage. And then to find yourself living near Leeds University, where the gender studies department was just starting up there then, I think, wasn't it? You can correct me if I'm wrong. And I think you were able to somehow trace how what started off as something really helpful to people has become this nightmare. And it comes, you see, but for me, it seems really strange that the biological gender is not being discussed, and they are not being taught that gender is decided biologically. That's that's huge. That's like saying that the earth is flat. And I know some people on the internet do say the earth is flat, but we don't expect to send our children to university to learn that the earth is flat or any other nonsense that they want to come up with. So I feel like our children are being poisoned. We send them there to learn, to become educated, but they're being poisoned by this completely false ideology of the fact that anyone can be whoever they want to be. And I think you did see how this came about over the years. I know you weren't actually a member of the university, but you had friends there and you were around it and you would go to talks and meetings. And I just wondered if you could give us a little bit of a flavour of that, Claire.
Well, it was very, very interesting. I mean, I should probably preface this to say that what we now know as gender studies originated back in the 70s and 80s as women's studies, and I think a lot of people will probably be familiar when they've heard about women's studies. And this morphed around about the late 90s, early 2000. It morphed into gender studies. And the thing is, it brought over with it a lot of the sociology which went with women's studies. And obviously a lot of people look back on women's studies and think, well, it was all right, it's an interesting thing in the historical context of the women's movement back in the 70s and 80s, but that is definitely second wave feminism. And it wasn't really until the 90s that this third wave feminism got underway. So I think what we had people who were quite politically motivated, wanting to ramp this up. So they transformed women's studies into gender studies, so that it wasn't just studying the social position of women in society and in different societies, which is a legitimate area of study, but they applied the same methodology and background of thought to both genders. So they're using this. They have these ideas of it's all based on oppression and hegemony. I think we all know what oppression means. Hegemony means something that has a dominance. You could say that in the 19th century, Britain had a world hegemony of naval power, for instance. And so what they've said is that taking the feminism of and sociology of women's studies from the 70s and 80s, they've applied that to gender differences, but they've completely left out anything to do with the biological side of gender. So they've entirely focused on the social aspects of gender. So one of the first things I found out when I back in that late noughties kind of era, when I was looking into the recommended reading lists and all this, I found that it was only about social presentation. That's all they were interested in. When I started raising this with the graduate students who are doing PhDs and masters there, they would all say, well, no, it's not about that. It's not about biological gender differentiation. It's about the socialization. And I would always argue that the socialization only goes on top of what we're already born with, and that people can be trained in a particular direction, but there are certain things that if you don't have it in you when you're born, and then you're unlikely to be able to acquire it later as you go along. But then we see that they not only want to remove the biological, the genetic, the developmental, the hormonal aspects from human development, gender development, sexual development, but they want to say that this has nothing to do with gender, that gender is merely just a social construct. So they're taking this away from anything to do with biological reproduction, which is the root, it's the foundation, isn't it? So that was where I began to realise that I was in really strange territory with these people. Well, I'll just pause there and pass it back to you for a moment, Annie, before I can go on. I'm sure there's lots to go on that.
Because there's a couple of things I'm thinking of. I wonder if it might be an idea just to quickly explain here how gender is decided by biology, because some people won't know that. They're not being taught it in the universities. And then also, could we talk, I don't know whether you've got a view on this, but I'm just sitting here wondering, what are the biology departments doing in these command and control centres for the New World Order, i.e. the universities? I mean, aren't they, they must meet up in the staff room or at certain times with the gender studies people, and is there a huge clash, or are the biology people just keeping quiet? You may not know anything about that to be able to pass a view, but I think...
I don't have any contacts in the biology departments. I suspect probably the situation is that they probably realise something like this is going on, and they probably half the time think, oh, it's none of our business, and the other half of the time they probably think, oh, crumbs, those cultural Marxists are going mad, and we better not say anything because otherwise we'll be, labelled as transphobic or whatever, So I can't really say much more about that. However, as far as the biological differentiation and developmental side of gender goes, this is something which was quite well researched back in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and there's tremendous amount of detailed information known about this. Principally, what happens is that, as most people will know, when a child is conceived, they receive a gamete from their mother and from their father. They have the X chromosome from their mother, and then if they're going to be a girl, they can receive an X chromosome from the father, or if they're going to be a boy, they take a Y chromosome from the father, and then they develop. However, the full development of sexual differentiation is something that isn't immediately apparent, of course, because obviously you just start with a few cells, and it takes 9 months to, achieve full maturity of the fetus to be born, and at various different stages along the way, different aspects of sexual differentiation and gender differentiation take place. So the point that's really most important to understand is that, first of all fetuses, all embryos, all mammalian fetuses and embryos begin out morphologically female. And it's only through the developmental influence of hormones in the uterus that causes the child to develop into a male child if they have a Y chromosome, and the morphology does not change other than the internal sex organs developing if the child is a double X female. So if the correct embryonic hormonal influences take place at the correct times, you will get, first of all, you will get the sexual differentiation of the child's own sex organs, testes and ovaries, but also the development of the other parts of the sexual organs, which are male or female. And now the thing is that the nervous system develops into a differentiation between male and female at a different stage. So obviously there's still a lot of research to do on this, but it was established in the early 2000s, and I've always pressed this piece of evidence quite strongly, but the people at Gender Studies don't really like it. There was a team of neurologists led by two people I think they're Dutch and Chinese, Guren and Zhu, and they found that certain parts of the limbic system were not only different between normal men and women, but that transsexuals had the opposite part of this, the opposite type of differentiation from what you would expect. So somebody who was a transsexual had a less developed part. There's a particular part of this striate nucleus, and a part of it, basically, how it's understood is it seems to develop more under the influence of the male influence hormones in the uterus, so that there is a distinct brain difference between females and males, which is thought to possibly be implicated in this sense of gender identity. There's also other research which has been done by Professor V.S. Ramachandran, who is Professor of Neuropsychology at, I think it's San Diego University, California. He's probably getting a hard time these days, because he's suggested also neurological mechanisms, and he's a very interesting chap. He gave the Reith lectures on the developmental aspects of language and brain structure about 10 years ago, about 2004, 2005, I think. And what he has suggested, and I've seen this in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, and I've seen it in the stacks of the Brotherton Library at Leeds University, and he's a very erudite chap, and he's done this research, and he has produced evidence that indicates that there is some kind of mapping which is different between males and females, and between transsexuals who have strong physical sense of dysphoria, of cross-gender, cross-sex identification. So that's all a bit complex, I'm sorry. But the point... No,
it's fine.
But I think the point I'm trying to make is that you don't just become a male or a female from having an X or a Y chromosome on top of the base X chromosome that you receive from your mother. It's a complex process. If it goes ahead normally, and it usually does, then you just get a normal male or a female. But if you can get some of these slight nuances of hormonal influence on development can retard the development of the male morphology in this striate nucleus. In other words, the part of the brain which should be developing and creating this sense of masculinity, it doesn't. For whatever reason, and there is a lot of concern these days. Things like I think it's bisphenol it's a chemical that comes out of plastics, which is floating around in water everywhere. That tends to have a feminizing effect. Plus, also soya has phytoestrogens which have feminizing effects. So these are of concern, that they can possibly be influencing the development of children in the uterus. So I'm sorry that was rather long and complicated, but it is there's a lot more I can go into, but I'll cut myself short at that point and get it back to you, Annie.
Okay. So thank you, Claire. That was really interesting, and I think people will find that useful. So really, what we're now at the stage with all of this, because most people are oblivious to it still, but those who are awake are watching something unfold now, because this has been a plan of the death cult we call the New World Order, where the more they confuse us sexually in terms of our gender, and break down the family, and say that we can't call mum and dad, and all these things that they're doing, we know is just a way. It's not that they even really believe it. At the highest levels, they don't believe it. It is being used as a tool to destroy society, to destroy how you destroy a society starts off as a family, and then the family then goes into the society. So you attack, if you want to attack a society, you attack the family, and you also attack the masculinity of the men. It's really, really obvious once you wake up. A lot of things that didn't make sense before suddenly start to wake up, start to make sense. Sorry. So what I'm thinking, I'm looking at this now politically, because in terms of the New World Order, we are winning that battle. We won that battle with Brexit, and then we won again with Trump. And both of these actions have really routed the globalists, and they're really on the back foot. And there are some people that even say they are so much on the retreat, and everything they're doing is just a sort of Parthian shot to distract us while they retreat. And so I'm now wondering how, because there are so many huge cans of worms that need to be sorted out. One of them is paedophilia, that the New World Order seems to be run by, somebody called it an empire of paedophilia. And that's, Trump's now starting to look at that, and he's empowering others to look at that. And there's been lots and lots of arrests of pedophiles. But it kind of plays into this same thing, because it's for me, it's not pedophilia, but it's almost as sick to have these totally brainwashed, totally often hate-filled people educating our children in complete nonsense and filling their head with poison that will confuse them for the rest of their lives unless we can help them get over it. Because I remember when I was at college, when I was at university, I used to have some really, really crazy ideas. And I think university is good for that, because it's a safe space, to use one of their words, where you can play with really wacko ideas. And the reason it's safe is because no one's going to take you seriously. And so, and we didn't have internet then, and we didn't have Facebook, and we didn't have social media. And so whatever we thought, the world wasn't going to hear about it anyway. So in this way, I'm rambling a bit, but I'll get there, Claire, sorry. In this way, our children have not only been deliberately poisoned by the teachers who are there not to tell them. Education is not indoctrination. Education is teaching someone how to think, not what to think. But these teachers seem to think that it's what to think, and they're going to teach them what to think, and this is what they're teaching them. I don't know how we're ever going to sort this out, because it's become so deep and so insidious, and it was never intended that we would sort it out, because nobody ever thought we would win. They thought they were going to win. They almost had won. They almost had America by the short and curlies, and Britain by the short and curlies, and the EU, Europe, all of that. And it's only started to unravel really in the last 18 months, 2 years, for them to realize, oh God, we haven't got this. And so we've now got to go in there and clean up that mess, as far as I'm concerned. I haven't a clue how to do it. I don't know if you do, Claire, or you've got any thoughts on that.
Oh, well, I think one of the things that strikes me is that the reason why they've ramped this up so much just in the last year or so is that they realise, as with so many other of these aspects, that it's slipping away from them. I've noticed, there are other transsexual or transgender people on the internet who are saying the same kind of things as me. That we're not doing this to deconstruct the gender of society. I've been writing a bit more on my book this week, and one of the things that I've been focusing on principally is how it was an inner struggle with myself to come to terms with this. And I think it should be. I don't think that it should be made too easy. I mean, I think I'm repeating myself slightly from last time, but I don't think it can be repeated too often, because what we see, as you said, about from the childhood, people are indoctrinated. Children are now being indoctrinated from the earliest age to be confused basically, not to think of themselves in these terms. And the point is that there is a certain developmental acquisition of gender identity, but it's only a kind of nuanced overlay or development of the existing inner core. So you can help a child to develop it. It's like you can help a child to learn a musical instrument by teaching it how to play scales. It doesn't mean that this is entirely artificial. You say, if Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart's father hadn't noticed that his child had some aptitude for this, he probably wouldn't have, given him all the extra tuition. And this is the same thing. Boys and girls have particular inclinations, and those inclinations should be encouraged, but also they should not have contrary notions put in their minds. They shouldn't be. I think it's seriously problematic, to use a word that is common in gender studies. It's seriously problematic to introduce children to ideas of transgenderism when they are very young, because these are things that they need to work out and come to understand in their own lives, their own bodies, their own families, and work it out. When they're given this brainwashing at an early age, it messes with the natural development of their self-concepts. I looking back, when I think about how some gender studies doctoral students, one in particular I'm thinking of, said to me that, I think you just developed your sense of transsexualism because you identified with your mother for some reason rather than your father. She had absolutely no idea, because she was just seeing everything in terms of social programming. But if you look at nature, things develop naturally. I mean, even walking. Children that are put in swaddling clothes when they're born and not allowed to crawl, they will still walk at approximately the same age as children who crawl normally, because the development of the parts of the brain that are to do with walking has not been completed when the child is born, and then it develops, and then the child just wants to walk because that's what the brain is doing. You see how a horse walks within minutes of being born. These are natural things, the natural sense of what you are. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to confuse people. They're trying to confuse children in their upbringing. And since you've mentioned paedophilia, it does occur to me, I've seen numerous examples, I won't cite any by name, but I've seen numerous examples of even top people in American politics acting in very funny ways towards children. And you find that some people, they literally induct their children into these paedophile rings. And I think the only way I can understand this is that they perhaps would done the same to themselves when they were young, and how far this goes back, I wouldn't care to guess. But I think if you have people who are inducted into confusion about sexual identity, told that it's wrong to have these natural feelings of who you are, then this plays into the whole breakdown of the conventional sense of sex and gender identity that has existed throughout human history. And certainly this needs to have nuanced adaptation to the development of societies. Obviously, things like, the washing machine and the vacuum cleaner have immensely, liberated women from the toil that, what was standard in the past. But the the fact that women now have this more opportunity with their time than previously doesn't mean that the differences between the sexes have disappeared all of a sudden just because somebody invented one of these things, really, I think, just to go back to what you were saying, is that it is all about confusing people, and then that makes it more easy for the paedophiles, because we see here the breakdown of gender divisions, and then at the same time this all goes along with the complete normalisation of homosexuality. I'm not against homosexuality. It is a something that occurs in nature, but so do cerebral palsy. No one's going to say cerebral palsy is a natural, good biological adaptation. It's just something we have to take in our stride as part of reality. So normalising things which are not normal, things which are not optimum in terms of evolutionary biological survival adaptation. I'm sorry to use these big words, but you have to kind of pin these things down, What is life about? Life is about survival adaptation. Some of these things are not survival adaptive. I understand and I accept about myself, transsexuality is not survival adaptive for the whole species. It was survival adaptive for me because I'd have probably killed myself if I'd had to go on any longer living the life that I had before. But it doesn't mean that it was natural or the best or the optimum. It merely means that I made the best of a bad job. But it does not mean that all these other standards, accepted values of society should be broken down to, make people like me be seen as the standard of normality, or that all standards should be broken down. Because when they do, see, paedophilia easily slips in there. They've been constantly trying. I'm sure a lot of our listeners will be familiar with the many attempts over the last 40 or 50 years to bring down the age of consent, and not just 15, 14 possibly, but I mean to well prepubescent. And obviously this is really seriously dangerous stuff, but this is made possible, or at least they're trying to make it possible, through these constant breakdowns of all distinctions and all natural evolutionary patterns. So, anyway, I don't know what you think about that.
I think the other comparison with paedophilia is worth noting, and it is that they think they own our kids. And this is crucial. They think, and this goes actually back to some papal bulls that were enacted in the 14th century, where they have convinced themselves that this allows them to own humanity and own our kids and do what they like with our kids. So they're, poisoning their minds in the university, which is a kind of child abuse. We send them to university. They get into huge debt having to go to university these days. Sometimes it's a debt that they can never pay back, and the parents have to pay for them to go, pay all this money. And, these guys, the so-called elite, must be laughing up their sleeves at us because we're sending them to be poisoned. We're sending them to be abused. And it's a betrayal. It's something to do with a betrayal of trust, isn't it, Claire? Something to do with, they have a duty of trust. That's it. They have a duty of trust towards our children, and they are betraying that duty. I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think you're right. I think that, they're exploiting it. They're not just betraying it, they're exploiting it, not just abandoning it. Because going back to the university and hanging around with some of these people there, nearly a decade ago now, when I was, having the most contact with these people, I'm a lot wiser to it now, but I look back and I see how their thought processes were actually being corrupted to believe things and believe ways of thought which are just false, basically. And they they're based on supposed moral premises, but you can't change reality because it's unjust or whatever. But they do want to try. But I think that as we've seen with all these other things you mentioned over the last year, 18 months or so, something has happened. Something is happening within the psyche of humanity which is resisting against this corruption, this misdirection, because we know that these things are wrong, whether it be rule by a foreign government across the sea, or whether it be telling people that our traditional, conventional sense of gender identities that people have had for, since time began, are not only wrong, but they are oppressive. And it's just really, it is very irrational. And really we should... I'm not surprised that other transsexual people are also at the same time speaking out. It was really interesting, actually. There's a couple of interviews with a transgender lady. I'm not sure if she's transgender or transsexual, with Jordan Peterson, because it was really funny. If you juxtapose this with how he was mobbed by a crowd of rioting undergraduates calling him homophobic and nasty words, transphobic, and then immediately afterwards to watch an interview between him and a young trans person, and he's treating her quite respectfully, and she says to him, well, are you happy to call me she? And he says, yes. He says, because you are making the effort. He says it's a negotiation. You negotiate your identity with society. And if you can we all try to find our own acceptable niches in society that are suitable for our character, our identity, our inclinations. And he said, well, if you came into my class, I would call you she. You look like a woman, and just knowing that you're transgender does not change the impression that she has on people, and yet people are saying Jordan Peterson's transphobe. They're not even willing to debate the issues, and as I become more, take more of a profile on this issue, I kind of expect to get a bit of resistance about this, particularly from people. I'm looking forward to presenting my final book when I finally complete it to the head of the Gender Studies Department, because when I told her a few years ago that I was not going to pursue the course, she said, why not? And I said, well, it's quite clear that I would be swimming upstream for the entire duration of my sojourn in your department. And she said, oh, you could fight your corner. And I thought, well, yeah, but so actually I have gone off and I've fought my corner, but I think it's much better to do it under my own terms, because throughout the last 30 to 40 years while I've been dealing with this, I've always found that whether it be the radical feminists or gay liberation or women's studies or the lesbian feminists or the gender studies people more recently, they all have disagreed with my own sense of myself, of what to be transsexual is. It's always, oh well, you're trying to perpetuate the hegemonic dominance of patriarchy, or else you're role-playing and you're oppressing women, or else this is just a psychosis, you're just mentally ill. And all of these debates I've had with these people over the years, they've all absolutely refused to acknowledge my own sense, my own developing sense. I'm in my 60s now. I've thought about this every day since my earliest memory, and I've developed my thoughts about it, and I do believe that, the likes of Goran and Zhu and Professor Ramachandran, they are correct. There is a neurological basis to this, and at the same time, they are trying to take advantage of this, use it, exploit it. I think you're probably familiar with the way that the cultural Marxists like to take genuine phenomena and then corrupt them and exploit them and use them to the opposite of the way that they were originally intended. So I certainly, and I know most of the people who have the same kind of experience of being transsexual as I do, we do not want to change the gender basis of society. If I'd wanted to do that, I wouldn't have changed myself. I wanted to feel congruent with myself. I wanted to feel congruent with society. I achieved that to a reasonable degree, but not in any way following the kind of explanations and accounts of what this is about from these various radical political groups over that last 30 to 40 years. And yet, these people, they claim to have better knowledge, better understanding of myself than I have. So I think that, we really, I feel confident in being able to stand up against this world, which is really, it's very disingenuous for a start, and it's leading people into a lot of bad things.
I found this really fascinating. It's a real eye-opener as well to have somebody talking so frankly and so knowledgeably about something that confuses the rest of us no end. And I think it's really important that all the things you talked about, to shed light on the biology of it, how it happened psychologically, what the brainwashing is that's going on. So, because these are questions often that people are frightened to ask, and particularly of a transsexual, because they, it's like that's a whole foreign area to most of us, and we tend to avoid foreign areas. We don't want to go there. We don't want to offend anyone. We don't want to offend anyone who thinks they're a victim. And what's so great about you is that you don't think you're a victim, and it's just so really helpful to have all this information. So thanks so much for sharing with us today.
Well, thanks a lot, Annie.
I think we ought to finish now, Claire. But as I say, we'll be back again if Maria Miller is get that bill through Parliament. We'll be back again, and keeping this issue in the forefront of everyone's minds. But for now, thank you so much, and we'll thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot, Annie, and I'm sure this topic is not going to go away. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Not anytime soon. Thank you, Claire. Bye.
Cheers. Bye. Dated back in February. It was put back to April. Now it's been put back to May. There's no detail, no documents on it, no text, nothing. So it's kind of good news and bad news, really. I think it's kind of good news that it's not making any headway, but at the same time it's kind of bad news that they're not really letting anybody know what they're trying to foist on us. So I think we have to keep an eye on this, and I think they might be realising that there's a little bit more resistance to this idea than they actually originally imagined, because this is obviously it's very heavily driven by the political left. They desire to destroy our concepts of gender, which is why I call my book The War on Gender. And we see one of the aspects of this we're seeing becoming quite prevalent at the moment is this idea that we should all be using these what Dr. Jordan Peterson calls made-up pronouns. These some places they have, I think Facebook, last time I counted, had 38 different genders, and apparently New York State has a larger number than that. And so this is what these people are trying to do is they're not only trying to create a world in which anybody can be either male or female according to their whim of the moment, but even actually the next step, which they're already, trying to implement in a lot of places, is, well, universities, of course, is this idea that to use gendered pronouns, he and she, is oppressive. This is the line that they always take. If they don't like something, if they want to change something, it's oppressive. Women having children is oppressive. And we have a big episode of resistance to this. I'm very, very pleased to say I recently discovered Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, who is a clinical psychologist, and I think he's at Toronto University, and he has challenged these made-up pronouns big time, because the students' union tried to get the university to implement an order that people must use certain words. And one of his arguments is that it's all very well being prohibited from using certain words, but to say that you must use certain words, of course, is entirely the other way around. You can say, oh, well, you can't use certain words because they're, deeply offensive to black people or something.
Found Leeds University when they set up their gender department, and she's got quite some interesting information to tell us about what she saw at those times and how that sort of embryonic gender studies has grown into this nightmare that we have now, with where people have their own invented pronouns and so on. So I think that's more or less it. That's what we're going to be talking about. So let's get on with it. Hi, Claire. Are you there?
Hi, Annie. I'm here, yeah.
Great. So the first thing I want to ask you is what's happening with Maria Miller? Is she still trying to get that bill through Parliament where we're going to have to all have transgender toilets?
Well, there's absolutely no progress in Parliament officially. I've looked at the Hansard and Parliament websites, and it's been put back again, basically. I think it was being put back to April. It was due to be debated.
Hello, everyone. Today, I'm back with Claire Ray Randall, who we talked with, there must be about a month, 6 weeks ago now, on the whole issue of transgender toilets, mainly looking at transgender toilets in the UK and a bill that Maria Miller is trying to get through Parliament so that we could have to have them here. And I think they are already actually being put in here in schools, in universities and places like that. So that was the initial conversation. And then we had a quite general conversation around Claire's experience, because she had herself medical sex reassignment about 30 years ago. So she speaks as a transsexual, but at the same time, she has a degree in psychology, and she also studied biological psychology. And she was also a